the impression I'm getting is that the problem started with the Christianity against the Moors.
There was a tie-in to the Moors, but mostly the strongest connection was with the idea of ethnic cleansing that started with Ferdinand and Isabella back in 1492. You see, what happened was the King of Portugal decided that he would love to own all of Iberia, Portugal and Spain. So he cut a deal with Ferdinand and Isabella. And he said, I'd love to have your daughter's hand in marriage. And they said, okay, that's great, but what you're going to have to do is kick the Jews out of Portugal, kick the Jews and Moors. There were very few Moors left in Portugal by that time, but kick the Jews out of Portugal. So the king said, it's a deal. And so he issued an edict in Lisbon in December of 1496, telling the Jews that they had 3 months to pack up their belongings and leave. At the very last minute, in March of 1497, when the Jews were supposed to leave, he closed all the ports. He closed the port of Lisbon, Porto, and Faro in the very south of the country, and rounded up the Jews and had them forcibly baptized. Why? Because he didn't want to lose a significant part of his population. As I was saying, Jews were doctors and surgeons and vintners and shoemakers and silk weavers and everything else, and he didn't want to lose them. So he had them forcibly converted. If a Jewish person refused to convert, he or she would either be murdered or have their children taken away. So virtually everyone converted. The last chief rabbi of Portugal protested and refused and was buried up to his neck in dirt along with 4 other Jewish men and murdered, and their bodies were tossed overboard at sea. So what happened then is there were no Jews left in Portugal. They became new Christians or conversos. The negative term is moranos, meaning swine. The more positive term that the Jews used amongst themselves is Hebrew, excuse my pronunciation, but they called themselves anusim. And so a new class of citizen was made in Portugal, these anusim. And unfortunately, what most people do not understand, even today in Portugal, Spain, even experts, what they do not understand is that when that happened, the Jews lost all their autonomy. I sometimes talk about Jewish urban autonomous islands in Portugal prior to that time, because they could have their own schools, they could have their own courts, they could have their own synagogues, they could basically run their own lives. But once they converted, they were subject to the whims of the church. So they lost their schools, they lost their courts, they lost their synagogues, they lost their books because they were confiscated by King Manuel. So they lost their connection to Torah, to Kabbalah, to prayer books, to everything. And the church took advantage of that. Now, King Manuel gave them 20 years to lose their Jewish customs and habits. He knew that you can't convert people and expect them to lose all their traditions overnight. He gave them 20 years, but that didn't happen. Because 9 years later, in April of 1506, during the secret Passover celebrations, a riot broke out. There were problems in Lisbon at the time, a drought, plague. People were a bit crazed. And the Jews, the converted Jews, were attacked in a typical pogrom, anti-Semitic pogrom. So 2,000 of these converted Jews were taken from their homes, murdered, and burnt in the main square, the Rocio. We know details about this because there are contemporaneous versions. So we know, for instance, that northern sailors probably from Holland or France, paid for the wood to burn the Jews. It never would have occurred to me that someone would need to pay for the wood to burn these people, but I've discovered this in my research. So it was a form of entertainment, if you will, for the people back then. 2,000 Jews, converted Jews estimated by the historians, were murdered. And if you think about it, there were probably only between 5,000 and 10,000 Jews in Lisbon at the time. So everyone living here who was a converted Jew would have lost a father, mother, brother, sister, niece, nephew, son, or daughter. So everyone was affected directly by this huge tragedy. And then, from that point on, anyone who could get documents to leave, enough money to leave, started leaving. but very few people were able to do so. We tend to think that people could just cross borders at will back then, but it's not true. You needed papers from the king to leave, or you had to leave surreptitiously, which was dangerous. And then what happened is another 27 years passed, and in 1536, the Inquisition was established. And what did the Inquisition try to do? Again, very few people in Portugal, even experts, understand what the Inquisition was doing. In theory, at least, the Inquisition had no power over a practicing Jew. As I said, Jews had a certain autonomy, except that there were no Jews left in Portugal at the time. They were conversos, barranos, new Christians, or anusim, and the church had control over them. So what they did was they invented this money-making scheme called the Inquisition to go after anyone who was backsliding, anyone who continued to practice Jewish customs in secret. So you could be arrested and persecuted, thrown in prison, tortured, tormented for years for simply cleaning your sheets on Friday afternoon prior to the Sabbath, or for lighting candles on Friday evening, for whispering a Hebrew prayer, for still having a Hebrew book at your home, for sweeping, cleaning your house on Friday afternoon prior to the Sabbath. A neighbor, an enemy, might denounce you, and then you'd be arrested by bailiffs, taken to a special inquisitorial prison, and locked up, and tormented and tortured. Why? Because they were trying to get you to name names. They wanted you to say, yes, I am a Jew, secretly, and my wife also is, or my cousin is, or my neighbor is. They wanted more people. And they also confiscated all your assets. So it was this huge money-making scam for the Catholic Church that persisted in Portugal all the way from 1536 to the 1770s. So for 20 successive generations, people who wanted to continue to be Jewish either got out, and thousands did. They left whenever they could to go to Constantinople and Smyrna, for example, in the Ottoman Empire, making those cities the largest Jewish cities in Europe, if you want to consider Turkey Europe. They also left for Italy, Ferrara, for instance, for North Africa, for Morocco, Tetuan, and later, at around 1610, when they were accepted in Holland, they left for Amsterdam, The Hague, Rotterdam. And so what happened in Portugal is that Judaism eventually either died out or went so far underground that nobody knew about it.